The 21st Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit kicked off on September 16th in the Tajik capital of Dushanbe. This year, the multilateral association's main focus will be on Afghanistan. What role can the organization play in stemming terrorism rooted in Afghanistan, but also from spreading across the region? What's the strategic significance of integrating Iran into the SCO family? And what fresh challenges will the organization face next? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Kasturi Manikam, sitting in for Liu Xin. Joining me for the discussion are Zun Ahmed Khan, a researcher from the Belt and Road Strategy at Tsinghua University, currently in Qingdao. Victor Gao, a Chinese international relations expert and also chair professor at Suzhou University in Beijing. And Joseph Mahoney, professor of politics from East China Normal University, joining us from Memphis, Tennessee. Thank you all for joining us on The Point. Now, Professor Gao, let me begin with you. Afghanistan is expected to be a key focus of this year's SCO summit. Now, analysts say the SCO summit will try to reach a consensus on dealing with the Taliban and urge the international community to ease pressure on the group. What are your expectations here?
Thank you very much. First of all, SCO was set up about 20 years ago in anticipation of all the turmoil that's expected out of Afghanistan. And over the course of 20 years, the war in Afghanistan did not solve the fundamental problems against which SCO was set up for. And I think it is high time, and it's very logical and natural for SCO Summit to focus on Afghanistan, because there is a turning point in Afghanistan. Nobody knows what eventually will become of the Taliban leaders, whether Afghanistan will be on the road for peace and stability, or again become a hotbed for terrorism and radicalization. Therefore, SCO need to make a decision as to how to deal with the potential different possible scenarios out of Afghanistan, and how to make sure that Afghanistan will never become another hotbed of terrorism, extremism, and radicalization. I think this is a task for all the member states and observer states of SCO, and it has fundamental significance for peace and stability in this part of the world.
Now, I want to talk about terrorism a bit later on in the show. Now, the SCO's priority for the past 2 decades has been ensuring security and stability across the Eurasian region. Professor Mahoney, what do you think are the organization's biggest concerns about Afghanistan?
Well, as Professor Gao noted, the organization was, I think, reimagined in 2001, and its new agreements put in place in 2003. But it really began before that, right, with what was called the Shanghai Five back in 1996. And that organization, not unlike the SCO, was devoted to countries in Central Asia, trying to reduce border tensions, reduce troops on the border, create more security. But one of the interesting things about the SCO, up until this point in time, and I think in many senses, the organization is very fortuitous because it is an organization that's sort of made for the moment, but also ready to sort of expand and meet the moment in ways that it hasn't been able to in the past, or hasn't needed to in the past. But what I really mean is, in the past, it's primarily been a group where people can talk about things and come to some sort of consensus, but then really act bilaterally, so that other players in the region know what's going to happen, but then the actual resolutions take place between two countries who are working out some differences. We're seeing that change a little bit with the Afghan test, with some military training or exercises in Russia with all the groups participating. But I think Afghanistan has always been the thing, the situation after 9/11, when this organization really began to mature. It's always been the situation that this organization was going to have to deal with, and I think now it's going to have to learn how to be a little more multilateral and a little more prepared to deal with the challenges that are coming down the pike.
Well, let's talk about the two big players in the SCO, China and Russia. Now, first, China. It will pay attention to the long-term stability and economic development of Afghanistan, as these will impact China's projects in Central Asia. Zoon, given your expertise, how can China's Belt and Road Initiative possibly help strengthen Afghanistan's economy?
Firstly, thank you for having me on the program. I think given that you have two guests who have said very aptly what the Shanghai Cooperation Organization aims to achieve. And for me personally, I feel like the Shanghai spirit, which is really that idea of bringing synergy in the region, is very deeply linked and basically compatible with the Belt and Road vision. So the Belt and Road, the way I see it, coming from Pakistan, a country that is also immensely benefiting from this idea and also practical projects, is about problem solving, is about helping countries address their basic needs, understand that these are countries that have young populations that are in need of opportunities that need to be, that can be met by basic infrastructure development to start with. So it's all about problem solving. It's about helping countries make long-term plans for their economic and eventually socio-economic stability. That said, I think another important factor to understand is that Afghanistan is really the heart of Central Asia. Afghanistan is that key country that opens from the west of China, connects Central Asia with South Asia, and also towards Europe. So the stability of Afghanistan is critical, not only for China's Belt and Road vision. If I talk about CPEC, for instance, our long-term goal for the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is also that Pakistan can act as a deep sea port for Central Asian countries through Afghanistan. This is the way we can really untap the true potential of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and for our people. So the Belt and Road is about connectivity, synergy, and for Afghanistan at this point, a country that is badly in need of basic investment. Another thing to note about the SCO, for instance, which I connect with the BRI, is that we are looking at long-term holistic approaches to address the issues that we face in the region, which are the three evil forces: terrorism, separatism, and extremism. And a way to address those is really by improving the economic situation of countries, by helping people find better opportunities, by creating mutual avenues of interest between countries that otherwise suspect each other, but they have so much in common that they are truly invested in each other. So if I try to sum up everything I said, I think definitely the Belt and Road Initiative aims to build, to help developing countries, to help countries in general build their economies, to help them receive the much needed infrastructure aid or infrastructure projects that are a prerequisite for the economic growth and development that is absolutely essential for them to stabilize and prosper. So in that sense, yes, China has a very important role to play. China has that experience. We have many successful cases of the BRI helping countries improve. And for Afghanistan, that is definitely going to be critical if we are talking about long-term stability.
All right, Russia, meanwhile, is reportedly keen to reclaim and assert its role as the protective power for the Central Asian states, promising to upgrade its weapons system. Professor Mahoney, talk to us about Russia's interests.
Well, you know, Russia historically, a lot of these Central Asian states were republics during the old years of the USSR, and these were areas that were clearly in the Russian sphere of influence. And of course, Russia has its own difficult history in Afghanistan and feels vulnerable, as other countries do, given some of the challenges of Islamic separatism and radicalism in the southern parts of Russia proper today. You know, the challenge has been, I think, and really, I think what the SCO was really trying to do was to make sure that as China was a rising power, as China was expanding economically, that it wouldn't destabilize the region, it wouldn't step on Russia's toes, that everyone would come to an understanding, and this would be potentially a win-win for everyone. And I think that's still the case. But you know, since we've seen the rise of SCO from 2002, 2003 onward, we've had these other developments with BRI, AIIB, And in some ways, they've really begun to, outpace the SCO in some respects. But then we've also seen these other organizations, these other countries join those organizations. So I think really, we're in this sort of difficult period where we have this extreme challenge in Afghanistan. We also have the outsized position that China is playing economically in its ability to help lead development and lead things like CPEC and possibly help bring development to Afghanistan. And this is something that I think Moscow, it makes Moscow a little uncomfortable. It certainly makes India a little uncomfortable, and Moscow has close relations with New Delhi. But I think everyone is in agreement that this development needs to happen, and China, for better or worse, is the big power that's capable of pushing that through, and others are going to have to accommodate it, but China's going to have to move very carefully so that these other member states aren't unsettled by it.
And two additional concerns for Russia and Central Asia in particular are the refugee crisis and drug trafficking. Now, they would expect some kind of commitment from the Taliban. Professor Gao, how do you think the Taliban should act in this regard?
Well, first of all, I think every one of us in this part of the world and in the international community as a whole need to urge the Taliban leaders to do the right thing. That is, to put Afghanistan on a track of stability and development, and don't prevent girls from going to school, don't prevent women's right to go to work. This will be truly a very important litmus test as to what exactly will become of the Taliban government. Now, assume Taliban leaders will do the right thing, will ease the tensions in Afghanistan, work for national reconciliation, building up stability, etc. Then, of course, there are lots of things SCO member states and international community as a whole can do. First of all, Afghanistan now is faced with one of the biggest humanitarian catastrophes yet to happen, and if it happens without being able to contain this catastrophe, you are talking about hundreds of thousands of people starving, and some of them probably will starve to death. So everyone need to step up, and everyone need to be fully mobilized to solve this humanitarian problem. Now, drug trafficking, drug production in Afghanistan has been a curse for the international community for several decades. There are different reasons why opium has been grown on such a large scale in Afghanistan. But whatever the reason, I think the international community need to work with the new Afghan government to make sure that the drug production and trafficking out of Afghanistan will stop, because otherwise you are talking about spilling over effect, poisoning people in millions. You are talking about in several dozens of countries throughout the world, and this truly will be a curse on mankind. So lots of challenging things in Afghanistan, and traffic of drugs, migration of people, refugee issues, humanitarian issues, food shortage, you name it. So you are talking about a whole lot of headaches yet to come out of Afghanistan. All of us need to be on full alert. SCO need to be fully mobilized to come to the rescue of Afghanistan when the circumstances are right, or urge the Taliban leader to do the right thing, and also, in the worst case possible, prepare for the worst emergency out of Afghanistan.
Now, as all of you have mentioned so far, tackling terrorism in Afghanistan is one of the biggest concerns. Earlier this week, Chinese troops arrived in Russia to participate in the SCO's Peace Mission 2021, which has been called a counterterrorism military exercise. And all 8 member states of the SCO will take part in this military exercise. Professor Mahoney, tell us more about this, and how will it contribute to regional security?
I think this is really a new development, because historically the SCO has really been not about military affairs. I mean, it's dealt with security, it's dealt with coming to agreements so that we can lower troop numbers and demilitarize borders relatively. So I think this is sort of an interesting new development. The bigger question, I think, is, it's always been the SCO's intention not to try to get into the business of what the UN does in terms of peacekeepers or international regulation. I think it's always been something, how can we work out differences locally? How can we come to understandings between us? So this is really an interesting new development, and I think it's going to portend to some possible big changes that might affect Afghanistan. But from my position, I think the really important thing is if you have all of these countries that are now having a shared military exercise, I think that's really much more important for these countries. The fact that China and India and Russia are working together in that respect, given the fact that these are all three members of the SCO, is really much better, I think, for the security differences of these three countries. And so that's where I think the benefit is most readily seen, and how that plays out potentially for Afghanistan or other possible terror places, should they emerge, remains to be seen.
Now, with members as diverse as India and Pakistan, Professor Gao, how united are the members in terms of tackling terrorism in Afghanistan and preventing terrorism from spreading across the region?
Well, first of all, I would say SCOD should do the mission almost impossible, because you are talking about countries sometimes with very divergent or conflicting views or objectives. However, within the SCO framework, all countries need to pitch in and do the right thing. And terrorism in one country, for example in Afghanistan, is not restricted just to terrorism in that particular country. Terrorism, as we understand, sometimes they are non-state actors. They can spill over across the boundary of nation states from one country to another. And sometimes these terrorist groups deliberately hide themselves from the view and blend into the communities, etc., making it almost impossible to speedily identify where they are, what their mission is, for example. So cross-border cooperation, regional cooperation is absolutely a must. And I think we need to outsmart the terrorists. We need to be on the preemptive strike so that whenever they are on the move, all the countries of the SCO organization will be on alert, and we can take concerted efforts together to strike out at the terrorists, because otherwise you are talking about the possibility of major spillover from, let's say, Afghanistan or another country in terms of extremism, radicalization, and terrorism, and in China's Xinjiang region in particular, separatism. So we all want to guard against such tendencies and radicalization, and we urge all the members of the SCO to be fully united for this mission of fighting against terrorism.
The United Nations has raised over $1 billion in emergency funds from international donors to help the civilians in Afghanistan. Professor Gao mentioned this earlier. What is the SCO planning to do to help alleviate the humanitarian crisis in the country? Zun, tell us, how can the SCO help Afghanistan to rebuild?
Well, I think firstly it's important. The most important factor, the reason why I think the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is absolutely significant, and how this mechanism builds itself, evolves, however necessary, to make sure that we're able to tackle this huge challenge, is essential, because all of us countries, regions rise and fall together. So we as a region will be impacted. This is what Mr. Gao also said. This is a basic consensus that we as the region, as SCO, as countries that are part of the SCO, we need to build that common consensus, because that is the only way forward. That is the only rational way forward that can benefit all of us. That said, how can now the SCO ensure that it can play a more vital role? For instance, like Mr. Gao said, yes, the SCO is not planning to replace the UN in any way, but we as countries, we share borders with Afghanistan. One of the things we want to ensure is that we can provide safe passage for goods, for aid. Pakistan is also playing a role in this. This is one way that us countries can help. Secondly, it is in all of our interests that Afghanistan stabilizes, because it's a fact that if there's instability in Afghanistan, firstly, that can give rise to terrorism as well. It can become unfortunately, can become a hotspot for terrorist organizations to play. And this will not stay within Afghanistan's borders. It will affect all of us. So addressing the basic humanitarian crisis is very important for various reasons, for many levels. So what the SCO can do and now plans to do is, let's support Afghan people. Let's try to make sure that this uncertainty doesn't move towards greater instability, which will harm all of us. And I think obviously the SCO will also think about, yes, the Taliban should meet certain basic requirements. We all want progress in the country and in the region. So let's see how they can form a more inclusive government, make sure that the mistakes that they made or the baggage that they carry from 20 years ago doesn't come back. And they have expressed that they're keen for support from the region, especially China, and of course the SCO, with Iran included. All neighbors of Afghanistan will also be part of the SCO. So what the SCO can do is play its part to convince the international community to play its role, to build better mechanisms to give Afghanistan proper aid, and especially to make sure that all neighbors of Afghanistan have a concerted and a compatible strategy that doesn't push Afghanistan forward into further crisis, but in fact that at least we play our part to make sure that basic stability, basic necessities can reach Afghanistan. Of course, all of us don't have thriving economies, so in financial terms, how much can a country some neighbors of Afghanistan help? We still have to ascertain, but at least we can play a supportive role and try and convince the international community to play its part.
So Zoom, let me stay with you.
I'll continue quickly. I'll quickly continue. But this is the short run. In the long run, obviously, we have to envision and eventually implement, use the SCO as a platform to envision projects that will result in the future stability and development of Afghanistan and other countries that are connected to Afghanistan. This is where the SCO can play an absolutely integral role.
You talked about investment, the need for investment earlier. The US Federal Reserve, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund have continued to freeze Afghanistan's bank assets, allegedly to prevent a misuse. How do you assess this? What is the impact on the country's humanitarian crisis?
Is this question for me?
Yes, it's for you, Zoom.
Yes, okay. So I think we need to understand that when you freeze a country's assets, so a lot of Afghans are worried that they will just not have food. They don't have basic resources. They don't even have the finance, the basic cash required to bring containers in their country, even basic aid to enter their country. They're not able to, the government doesn't have money to pay basic salaries to government employees that are necessary to have basic functioning in the country. And my view is, and I think this is something many would agree with, that how can we expect Afghanistan to, or the Taliban to build a government that is acceptable to all of us, and for Afghanistan to be basically stable if we are not even financially supporting? So of course, threatening sanctions and freezing the country's assets, all of this can have a very dire impact on Afghan people to begin with. So in that sense, we just all, and I think this is where the SCO is integral, because we are directly affected by the consequences of such decisions. So definitely we can play a role in also incentivizing the Taliban to form a government that is more acceptable, of course, but at the same time in convincing the international community that we have a responsibility. This is a country that is not economically developed. More than half of the country's population was dependent on aid for many years. This should not have been the case, but now that it is, we can't just isolate and abandon, and especially not the countries that have a direct stake. So this is just an incompatible strategy, and it's good that the United Nations, the SCO, many organizations are trying to raise awareness and trying to assist and facilitate Afghan people in this process. This is something necessary. We cannot repeat our own mistakes either. So of course the Taliban shouldn't repeat their mistakes, but we also need to understand that the only way a country can stabilize is by getting the right support as well, especially from the region.
All right, I want to talk about Iran. It has drawn much attention in recent days. There are plans to admit Iran as a full member of the SCO. Professor Gao, what does this mean for Iran and the SCO if the go-ahead is finally given?
Well, first of all, from the Chinese perspective, we hope Iran can become a full member of the SCO. We believe Iran is a great country, a country with great civilization, with a very unique religious affiliation, and it has a very broad, wide-reaching regional and international influences. So any plan to exclude Iran from the international community is doomed to failure. Now, Iran, if they continue onto the path of stability and development, can play a very important role in this region in particular. So I hope SCO's door will be wide open for Iran, and Iran can be well accepted, playing a very constructive role. This is especially important at the time when the United States has not given up its plan to isolate Iran and to corner Iran, for example, and the joining of Iran into SCO will help stabilize the situation in Iran as well as that part of the world.
Now, I just want to very quickly talk about the SCO in detail. It's entering its third decade. Its aim is to work under the ban of the Shanghai spirit, as Zoom rightfully said, providing an alternative to Western-dominated global governance. Professor Mahoney, what are your thoughts on this? What's your assessment of its achievements so far?
Well, I think that I would have agreed a couple of years ago with concerns that SCO was at a midlife crisis, that it was being surpassed in some ways by developments with other organizations that I mentioned earlier, AIIB and BRI, where the power was really tilting in the direction not simply the Shanghai spirit, but in the direction of Beijing. But I think that again that this Afghanistan issue, we're not really talking about a midlife crisis. We're really talking about the SCO coming into its majority. In other words, it's sort of emerging from its adolescence, if we want to use that kind of analogy. And that this crisis and this need to come together and to resolve this peacefully, as the U.S. is pulling out, and let's assume and let's hope that that the U.S. is not going to be a spoiler here, that it's really going to leave the scene and not going to continue to cause trouble.
All right.
That it's really going to require this sort of pan-Asian working together to solve problems, and I think that's what the SCO can mature as a multilateral organization and help accomplish.
All right, thank you, Zoon Ahmed Khan from Tsinghua University, Victor Gao from Suzhou University, and Professor Joseph Mahoney from East China Normal University. Now, lots to think about. We discussed a lot. All eyes will be on the two-day summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which opens on September 16th. This will be the first major meeting of regional countries since the Taliban announced their interim government in Kabul on September 7. And of course, Afghanistan will take center stage. With that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point. Download the CGTN app to watch our show, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. On behalf of our team, thanks for watching.